Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Mathieu.
And the press being excused from the Oval Office after a lengthy conversation with President Trump and President Lee of South Korea visiting the White House today to talk about a range of issues, as we just brought to you live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Mathieu in Washington. This is Balance of Power, the Monday edition, with a very busy day at the White House today, starting earlier with a news conference that we brought you live on Bloomberg. Now, of course, the president of South Korea bringing forth a number of issues, as I said, and answering President Trump's concerns that he expressed earlier today on social media, having said on Truth Social that he understood there was a purge or revolution that was going on in South Korea. He brought this to the president in front of that room full of reporters. And President Lee said through a translator that it has not been long since Korea overcame political turmoil following a coup by the former president. He says there's an investigation by a special prosecutor appointed by the assembly, and says that prosecutor is not under his control. He talked about U.S. bases, having heard reports of roundups at U.S. bases saying that there was no search and seizure on American bases, but they did look into the chain of command to try to learn more about this. The president had said he heard about a lot of bad things. I don't know if it's true or not. I'll be finding out, having suggested at the end of this conversation that I'm sure it is a misunderstanding. We can at least check that box. There's a lot more that could come from this meeting. That was just the conversation with reporters. They're going to have a working lunch now that could zero in on trade, as President Trump spoke to his positive relationship with not only Kim Jong-un, but President Xi. Kind of an interesting bit of color against this meeting today and the potential for a working relationship with Japan. I want to go to the White House now. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is on the North Lawn, having listened to that full conversation, engaging here on behalf of Bloomberg. Tyler, this is an important visit for this president. What else did we learn?
Yeah, hey, Joe, an incredibly high-stakes visit, and as you outlined, it was a relatively friendly welcome for the South Korean president, given the stakes ahead of this and President Trump's previous comments on Truth Social. The president said that he thinks the alliance between the U.S. and South Korea is great and that the country's relationship is warm. He even perhaps joked that the South Korean president and himself can travel together to China to meet Chinese President Xi Jinping. Of course, that did appear to be a joke. It was met with laughter in the room, but it does, of course, underscore really the heightened geopolitical ties here, how important an alliance South Korea is when it comes to the U.S. and countering tensions in that region. I will point out that President Trump confirmed that he would like to attend the APEC summit in South Korea happening in October. And I bring that up because it has long been speculated that that could be the potential site for a Xi-Trump meeting, just continuing here when it comes to President Trump's comments around China, also threatening heightened tariffs against Beijing if they do not release more of the magnets that we know have been holding up the negotiation. So that gave us a little bit of an insight into how those trade talks with Beijing are going. But of course, they're going to be focused on trade when it comes to South Korea as well, because as you well know, Joe, South Korea had secured that more preferential tariff rate of 15% on South Korean exports. But ultimately, we are still waiting on some of these key details on what that trade framework is going to look like. One of the big open questions here are additional details on that $350 billion investment pledge. You did hear both leaders really highlight this idea that a large chunk of that is going to go towards shipbuilding. It's our understanding about $150 billion worth of investment will go towards that in the United States. But other details, including how that fund's going to be structured, there seems to be some discrepancies between the two trading partners, with South Korea, for example, saying that this is going to be more around loan guarantees instead of direct capital investment, as just one example there. Just lastly, Joe, I'll leave you with something that you also mentioned at the top, which are ties with North Korea. Bloomberg News had reported earlier today that a top official to the South Korean president was planning to ask President Trump to reopen dialogue with North Korea, something, as you well heard, President Trump seemed open to saying himself that he has plans to meet with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in appropriate time.
So much to talk about here, Tyler. That was quite a session. The president also was asked about Ukraine and whether Vladimir Putin would make good on what seemed to be a promise to meet with President Zelensky during the Alaska summit. We have since heard from Sergei Lavrov that there is no plan at the moment for that meeting to occur. And President Trump said there could be big consequences if they do not meet. Do we have any sense of what he meant by that?
So this is actually a message, Joe, that President Trump had reiterated from last week. He had threatened last week that there would be big consequences if a bilateral, then trilateral meeting did not happen. And he said that that could take the form of additional economic sanctions. But he also said last week that this could take the form of the U.S. just doing nothing, stepping back and saying that it is up to you to figure this path forward, because we heard the president say what we have often heard, which is that it takes two to tango, in his words, when it comes to these negotiations. And he's really urging Russian President Vladimir Putin to come to the negotiating table. We know that a big sticking point here does appear to be those security guarantees, which was a huge focus of our discussion last week when we saw half a dozen European leaders descend here to the White House and try to show some sort of forward progress towards any sort of a deal for peace in Ukraine. Our reporting indicates that the Kremlin is now asking to be directly involved in what those security guarantees are going to look like with Ukraine, which is obviously problematic for those talks going forward. So President Trump now threatening big consequences if they do not come to the negotiating table. We're going to have to see what that timeline looks like. He's floated a couple of weeks, a couple of times, but at the end of the day, we're probably looking at perhaps some heightened economic penalties. Whether or not that sanctions remains to be seen.
All right, Tyler. Tyler Kendall on the north lawn of the White House. We're always better having her there, and I appreciate the update, Tyler. We could have talked about 10 different stories, but that's the way these things go when you bring in the press corps, and nice to see them all in the Oval Office getting answers to questions here live on Bloomberg. We want to update the markets. We haven't had a chance to talk to Charlie for a bit because we wanted to keep you in the Oval Office for that event here on Bloomberg. The governor of Utah is going to be joining us on the other side. Charlie, how's the trade look?
Right now we are lower on the S&P. Joe, Mathieu, S&P down 11. Drop there of 0.2%. Dow also lower. It right now is down by 0.6%. We got NASDAQ, though, pushing higher. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 25. That is a gain of 0.1%. On a down day for the S&P, the Bloomberg Mag 7 Index pushing higher by 0.8%. 10-year currently yielding 4.26% with a 2-year 3.72%. Gold, we'll call it unchanged, $33.72 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude oil now up 2%, $64.95 a barrel, and Bitcoin down 0.3%, $112,400 on Bitcoin. The Pinot family is weighing options for Puma, including a sale after the company lost more than half its market value in the past year. This according to sources. Right now, ADRs of the sneaker maker, they're up by 15.4%. Berkshire Hathaway not in the market to buy a train company. That according to CNBC. Berkshire shares down by 1.1%. And Raymond Mason, who expanded Legg Mason into one of the largest money managers in the United States, has died at the age of 88. Recapping, S&P down 9 right now. Drop there of 0.1%. Back we go to Washington. Balance of Power continues. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Mathieu.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much as ever. Charlie Pellet, live from world headquarters in New York, the voice of Wall Street and the New York subway. Just listen next time you get on the train. We've been spending time listening to the president here. Got a little bit off course in the conversation that we were having on Balance of Power because you never know what's going to come up in the Oval Office. But as you heard him professing the power of American energy when asked about a potential deal involving LNG with the South Koreans, he talked about oil and gas in particular. But there, of course, remains a massive need for electricity, electric power, renewable power, dare I say, as data centers sprout up out of the earth like weeds in this country. Enter Governor Spencer Cox's Operation Gigawatt. If you were with us a couple of months ago, you've actually heard about this project that aims to create a consortium and an ecosystem that will eventually bring more advanced nuclear power to states like Utah and other states throughout the West. Operation Gigawatt to identify and assess sites for a potential advanced nuclear plant. They want to have that sited and chosen by the end of this year, by the end of 2025, so construction can begin in the year ahead. You heard our conversation with Governor Cox and the CEO of Valor Atomics. And we have a different individual from that future ecosystem, who is with us today alongside the governor. First, let's introduce Spencer Cox, the governor of Utah. It's great to see you again, sir. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. And Chris Levesque is with us as well, the CEO of TerraPower, which is working on an advanced nuclear reactor that would be sited in Utah. Gentlemen, I'd like to ask you both about how all this is going to work. And Governor, why we're in fact adding another name to this list. What does this mean today to reaching that new level of power in Utah?
Well, you set the table very well. Operation Gigawatt is about doubling the energy production in the state of Utah, something that we need. If you care about economic progress in our country, if you care about national security, and if you care about just prosperity in general, we have to, and the environment. If you care about the environment, you have to believe in nuclear power, and we do. And so we are setting up that ecosystem so that the private sector will have the opportunity to bring the latest inventions, to bring the best technology to bear, and TerraPower is one of those technologies they're building right now, and the only construction nuclear capabilities happening in our country is happening with TerraPower. We're so excited to partner with Chris and his team, and we truly believe that what President Trump has been talking about in the Oval Office today is going to happen right here in Utah.
Chris, I'd love to hear about what you are working on at TerraPower, because it's a little bit different than some of the other nuclear technology that our viewers and listeners are probably used to. Natrium reactors are your specialty that use liquid sodium instead of water as a coolant. Does that make them safer or more dangerous?
Well, it certainly makes them safer and more economic as well. Thanks for having me, Joe. And thanks to Governor Cox, really, for your leadership with Operation Gigawatt. And of course, we already heard that the Trump administration is providing very strong support for nuclear and advanced nuclear energy, which is the form that Natrium takes. I've spent my whole career in nuclear energy, beginning in the Navy, and this is an industry that the U.S. created decades ago. It provides 20% of our electricity. But the fact is, the U.S. had fallen behind in the last few years. China and Russia have many more new builds than us. And with leadership from folks like Governor Cox, we're now prioritizing advanced nuclear energy. And it is very important for us to move to new technologies like the Natrium reactor, because they will be cheaper and safer than today's plants. Today's plants are quite safe. But if we look at a massive upscale, it's really important for us to move to the new technologies. China and Russia certainly are. The Natrium reactor, it's still a fission reactor. We break uranium atoms to release a lot of heat and boil water to make steam and drive turbines to make electricity the old-fashioned way. But by cooling the reactor with liquid sodium, it allows us to have a low-pressure plant, which is going to be safer. It's going to require much less steel and concrete. Another really important feature of the reactor is that we have built-in energy storage. And this is going to be really important in the Mountain West, where you do have quite a bit of renewables that you have to balance out. And built-in storage allows us to boost the energy output of the Natrium reactor throughout the day as the wind and the sun come and go, which is a limitation of renewables. So Natrium's a great balance to that. We're so excited to announce with the state of Utah and with flagship companies today a memorandum of understanding to examine Utah sites for Natrium deployments. So we'll be looking at multiple sites in Utah for their potential to host a Natrium reactor. As Governor Cox mentioned, we're already in the state of Wyoming building our first reactor there. So we're very happy to be in the Mountain West.
All right, Chris. Well, I mean, that's a heck of an elevator pitch. And Governor, we're talking about some pretty esoteric technology here, using gravity and thermal convection to enable passive cooling in this Natrium reactor. Last time you were on with us, Governor, you talked about a whole different approach to these small size micro-scale reactors. Do you understand? Are you becoming an expert on nuclear science, or are you just calling the smart guys to do the work?
Well, a little bit of both for sure. In fact, just last week I was at MIT with one of the nuclear physicists there, having these very conversations, and that's the thing. We're betting on all of these technologies, and truly, as Chris mentioned, the United States did lead the world when it comes to nuclear technology, and then we made a very bad decision. We decided basically since 1975, the year I was born, that we weren't going to bet on nuclear. The rest of the world has moved ahead of us, and that's a huge mistake right now as we are in an energy arms race. You mentioned the data centers and AI arms race, and we have to win. We can't lose this one, but we don't have to compromise on safety either. We can do both of those things. And the way you get better with this technology is to start building it. That's what we haven't been doing over the last 50 years, is actually doing the thing that we know we can do. We have the best scientists, we have the best innovators in the world, and Utah is betting on them, and the country needs that desperately right now.
Really interesting. Chris, let's say you get a site by the end of the year. That's your plan by the end of 2025. How long would it take to have an atrium reactor up and running?
Yes, Joe, we could mobilize a site shortly after that, because we've made a lot of progress with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in licensing that first plant in Wyoming. Then we're looking at about a 3-year construction duration for natrium reactors, which is much shorter than today's technologies that require all of the steel and concrete. So it's yet another reason for us to move forward with advanced technology. And I do want to point out, we're not only supplying, AI and, important energy security demands in the U.S., but, with leadership of people like Governor Cox, we're also saying if we can prove out this technology here, we can then export the technology where, nations that are hungry for electricity are inevitably going to be shopping for nuclear, and we need to offer a U.S. technology in competition with Russia and China, who will be peddling nuclear energy around the world.
Governor, there's a headline in Washington today that the EPA is pulling almost $62 million in solar grants from the state of Utah. Does that make your life more difficult when you're pursuing an all of the above strategy?
Well, it definitely doesn't help. And look, we are an all of the above state. We do have an immense amount of sunshine here, and we want to take advantage of solar for sure, and solar with batteries. But I just don't think most people comprehend the amounts of power that are going to be needed, that are needed right now. Look, the entire state of Utah runs on about 4 gigawatts of electricity. We have one data center campus that would operate on 4 gigawatts of electricity. I mean, that's over 100 years worth of electricity production and development in the state of Utah, and they need that kind of power right now. So we need all of it. We need the solar. We need the coal that is still burning in Utah, the cleanest burning coal anywhere in the world. We need the natural gas. Unfortunately, we have a lot of that too, and we have to bet on nuclear. And so that's what we're doing. We can't do nuclear overnight. It is going to take a few years, but we can certainly increase that time, the production time, the development time, and then actually getting that product out to consumers. We've been short-sighted. There is an abundance of energy out there. We're the ones making decisions to hold that back. Those decisions are now changing in a bipartisan way, and I'm so happy to see it. I'm so happy to hear blue state governors that are talking about energy development again in ways that they haven't in the past. Let's not make these false choices. Let's work on the solar side. Let's work on the nuclear side, and let's get it done.
Well, that's a really interesting answer. I guess these grants, $62 million worth, are a little more than a year old. This goes back to May of 24. Would you ask for these grants to be restored? And what does it mean for people paying their bills each month?
Well, look, again, we'll look at those grants and what each one of those was for. I'm going through that review process right now. We do know that there was money that was granted that is going to be spent on things that aren't going to help in the long term. And if we can divert that money in a way that will get us a better product, that will get us more, that will, again, help to lower prices, that's all I care about right now. I think it's a mistake to get in these fights where we're denigrating one technology over the other. We should, again, be trying to lift all of these technologies because they do all play a role. And certainly solar is going to play a role in Utah. It is right now, and it will continue in the future. But it can't be the only role. We had one administration before that was trying to stop us from using the technologies that we have that exist now with coal and natural gas. That was a terrible mistake. I want to make sure we don't swing the pendulum too far and start tearing down other technologies that are going to help us well into the future.
I hear you. Well, I don't know who you're going to show up with next, Governor, but I really appreciate the conversation. Spencer Cox, the Republican governor of Utah, Chris Levesque, president and CEO of a company called TerraPower. Check it out. These new reactors they're working on might help to answer some of the questions that we've been asking about power in the United States. I'll meet you back here on the late edition of Balance of Power, 5 p.m. Eastern, only here on Bloomberg.